Hi there everyone, welcome to the first video for week 8. In this video and the next video we're going to try to cover important topics in Leibniz's metaphysics as well as his physics. Now, for those of you who have done the reading for this week, you'll notice that we have a relatively short Leibniz piece on eternal truths, and then we have Emily du Châtelet, and it's like 16 pages total, so it's not very much. That was intentional because your midterm is due at the end of this week, so by 10/16 at 11:59 p.m. you'll have to have turned in your midterm review on Canvas, right? And if you need any extra time or you need accommodations or anything like that, it's important to try to get in contact with me as soon as possible. So the midterm's coming up. You don't have very much reading for this week, and so I'm gonna try to keep the video short as well. I want to be able to give y'all as much time as we possibly can to make sure you're working on your midterm and you're able to do everything that you want to do. So with that being said, there are some major topics in Leibniz's philosophy that we are not going to be able to talk about until next week. So what Leibniz has to say about what a substance is, and you might notice that he starts talking about monads, which is his word for what a substance is. Those are questions that we're going to have to leave to the side for now, begin to sort of understand the background of Leibniz's thinking, and then as we move into next week and we read the discourse on metaphysics and the monadology, then we will be in a much better position to be able to tackle the very difficult things that Leibniz says about monads. But the more background we have, the more we understand the general principles of his metaphysics as well as the basic orientation of his physics and how we're going to see that they come together, the more we will be able to appreciate the beauty and simplicity of his account. And obviously, feel free to disagree with me. There are many people who believe that Leibniz's solution to these problems is like the most contrived, the least intuitive or obvious, right? The most obviously like philosophers mumbo jumbo sort of thing. But, as is usual in this class, we're going to really try our best to read sympathetically but also critically through the authors that we investigate. So we're going to examine Leibniz from Leibniz's own perspective, and then, we're going to examine critiques of his work. In the same way that for Descartes, we start with the Meditations, and then we get into all the various criticisms of Cartesianism. Right. Okay, so that's what's on the docket for this video. We're going to talk about metaphysics. Specifically, we're going to talk about what Leibniz calls the primary truths. Okay. So, in the last video, we said that Leibniz is the premier philosopher of possibility. But what defines what is possible, right? So, just as a very brief recap, many of you wrote really excellent responses on the relationship between Leibniz and Descartes and Spinoza, but just to recap that slightly, for Descartes' conception of God, everything is possible. God can make a square circle, God can make a line, that's not the shortest distance between 2 points. God can violate logical laws. God can say A and not A, right? And the reason why is because Descartes envisions even logical limitations or mathematical limitations to God as illegitimate. That they're, a kind of limitation, they're a way that God is bound, right? And that's just not appropriate for the essence of God. So at the metaphysical level, right, talking about how things are for God, then it's not even possible to define possibility, right? Everything is possible. There's nothing that's impossible. That is just what it means for God's infinite power, is that this whole question becomes moot, right? Similarly, in a figure like Spinoza, there's no point in asking this question, right? Because for Spinoza, there is no metaphysically deep idea of possibility, right? He says that all possibility is all, contingency in the world. So whenever we use counterfactual statements, like I listened to this lecture instead of going to the store, and so on, right? We're making claims about what was possible, right? But for Spinoza thought that if you could envision God's perspective, if you could see things metaphysically the way that they really are, then there would be nothing left over, right? There's nothing that that would be possible that didn't happen, right? There's no way that God fails to fully express their essence, right? This is Spinoza's interpretation of absolute substance. It would take away from the absoluteness of substance if God had to, like, consider stuff, decide one way or another, right? That all of that, from Spinoza's perspective, all comes from our own finitude, our own weakness. So, for both the rationalist philosophers prior to Leibniz, there's not a coherent way to ask the question, what is the range of possibility in the universe? Because for Descartes, it's everything, and for Spinoza, it's nothing, right? And so it seems like in either case, we still really failed to give an adequate account of, like, the nature of possible events, right? Things that were possible but not actualized. And we have the deep sense, whenever we live in non-philosopher land, that these are real, right? I think about my own day as structured in terms of possibility. Well, I could record a lecture today, I could attend a meeting, I could hang out with my wife, right? And so, at least in our ordinary everyday thinking, we think about possibilities not just as imaginative or something like that, but we think of them as, like, real things that could have happened and didn't happen. So Leibniz takes this question to be really unaddressed by rationalist philosophers prior to him. And so he wants to develop something like a systematic answer. If possibility is real, if there are really things in the world that are possible but not necessary, right? Then we need to be able to define the parameters of possibility, right? Because otherwise we end up with this Cartesian position where everything is possible, right? And so Leibniz's answer to this question is, like, what circumscribes the domain of the possible? His answer is metaphysical laws. And what is the status of those metaphysical laws? Well, they are co-eternal with God. And we mentioned this very, very briefly at the end of last video, but what it means to say that metaphysical laws are co-eternal with God is that just in the same way that God exists, like, in some sense, before time or outside of time, and in fact, things about God have always been true and holds for all times, right? You might think a lot about Spinoza's letter on the infinite, where he draws a distinction between eternity and duration, right? Using that language, metaphysical laws are also eternal. Metaphysical laws are also things that are true for all times, for all places, for all possible worlds, right? They define the limits and the parameters of possibility. Now, that's a very interesting idea, right? And so, for Leibniz, this is the realm of the a priori truths of reason. So a priori, that's a Latin phrase that's going to come up a lot in this class, and it just means reasoning prior to or independent of experience, right? And the basic point is this: if these metaphysical laws structure not just my own universe, but all possible universes, then I can't just find evidence for them by like going out and looking or something like that, right? Because I would have no way of distinguishing the laws that hold for my possible world and the laws that hold for all possible worlds. And this is an important point for Leibniz. What he sometimes will call truths of fact, or truths that we acquire through experience, are always contingent, right? They happened one way, they could have happened another way. I don't see into the inner necessity of those relationships. By contrast with the truths of reason, I can always see why they are fundamentally necessary, and all I need to do is look at them rationally. And so what falls under the scope of a priori truths for Leibniz? Well, you have the truths of geometry, the truths of algebra. In some ways, Leibniz thinks a lot more about algebra than geometry, and logic and metaphysics. So these are domains where we don't rely on experience, right? And remember Descartes' point, in the case of the Kiliagon, the thousand-sided figure, I don't need to experience it or see it in order to know certain kinds of mathematical facts about it, right? And those mathematical facts hold with an absolute kind of necessity, not just a kind of contingency, as in our experimental knowledge. And so what makes all of these domains a priori truths, the truths of reason, is that we come to know them purely through reason alone. And how do we do that? Well, Leibniz says you can reduce all of these to identity statements, to a statement of the form A equals A. For those of you that have taken a symbolic logic class, you will probably realize why now Leibniz is credited with discovering or founding symbolic logic, or at least like being like an early version of formal logic, is because he thinks that you can discover independent truths of reason that come from logic that stem entirely from its formal structure. And this reduction to a tautology, right? Tautologies are just definitions that don't say anything. So like a cat is a cat is a tautology, right? And what that means is that you're not adding anything to the concept cat by saying that it's a cat, right? But so the basic idea in here, you might want to think about algebra a lot. Like think about how you solve algebraic equations, like 3x equals 9, right? Well, the way that you do it is you reduce it to an identity relation, right? So you want the two sides to be equal to each other. That is a funky looking 9. Okay. And so, in this case, you just divide both sides by 3, and then x equals 3, right? And then you solve to the problem. There's nothing more to know about this problem, right? It's not like there's like hidden secrets or something like that. No, you figured out everything that there is to know. You identified the formal structure. You reduced it to an identity. That's all you need to do. All right? So how can you use this kind of quasi-algebraic style of thinking to think about metaphysics? And that's what Leibniz tries to do in primary truth. So to move over to this next column on the board, So like right here, these 3-letter acronyms, these are acronyms for various metaphysical principles that Leibniz discusses in the primary truths. We can think about them as kind of going from the highest intensity down, which means that the principle of non-contradiction, this first principle, is going to be the most important, most general principle, whereas these other principles are lower principles in the sense that they apply to less stuff. Okay, and once we talk more about them, we'll be in a position to understand why that's the case. So, principle of non-contradiction. This is, in a way, the motor of the entire enterprise. What the principle of non-contradiction says is you cannot say A and not A. For those of you who have never taken formal logic or like a computer science class, the tilde here indicates a negation, right? So you can't say A and not A in the same way that you can't, solve an algebraic equation through something like this, 3 = 2, right? This would violate the principle of non-contradiction. You would know that you have the wrong solution in virtue of arriving at a contradiction. So, that's all well and good. Basically what Leibniz is saying is it's not possible either for finite creatures or for God to make contradictions exist. There cannot be a square circle. There cannot be, or married bachelors, right? You cannot have a contradiction in terms that really exists. Every time that we see a contradiction, right, that's a problem with how we're understanding the problem, right? In the same way that when you arrive at an algebraic equation that ends in a contradiction, as in this case, you know that something went wrong, right? You calculated something wrong, the person that formulated the question was wrong, something like that, right? Okay, so the principle of non-contradiction, what this lets us do is it now gives us a formal way at arriving at truth and falsehood. Truth, because things can be reduced to a tautology or an identity, right? A = A. And it gives us a criterion for falsity, because false propositions result in a contradiction, right? They say, whether explicitly or implicitly, A and not A. And so Leibniz thinks you can build this out, right? So the next principle that he states is actually the principle that in some ways Leibniz is the most famous for and defines his philosophical approach. And this is called the principle of sufficient reason. And what it means is that for anything in the universe, anything in time, anything eternal, there is a reason for why it is the way that it is, right? There's no blind spots in the universe. There's no scale or dimension or something like that where things stop making sense. There's no there are no miracles. Nothing happens in a willy-nilly sort of fashion. Everything is rationally explainable. And Leibniz thinks you can basically derive the principle of sufficient reason from the principle of non-contradiction. How? Okay, so imagine that the principle of sufficient reason is false, right? And that not everything has a reason, right? And so if that were the case, then I could derive whatever I wanted from stuff, right? Because there's no reason. I can't appeal to any further reason. So I would be able to derive from anything I wanted A and not A. right? So like if the universe were rationally inexplicable, if there's no way that I could ever know it, then I would have to be indifferent towards every possible explanation, right? So this is the principle of sufficient reason, and this is why everything exists in harmony with one another, is that at every layer of scale, for anything you can identify, you can always identify a reason for why it is that way. So Leibniz even says in a very interesting and funny passage, he was like, even if you imagined that in the universe there was only matter and motion, right? And that the smallest atoms of the universe or something like that were spheres, right? And so like little atom spheres sort of like create all of the individual bodies in the world. He says you would still need to explain why they show up as spheres rather than cubes, right? You never get to this level of like, people will say something like brute fact or something like that, where you can't offer any further explanation or reason. This principle makes this impossible in principle. Okay, I'm going to go through the remaining principles a little bit quicker now because those are the two most important ones. The principle of sufficient reason gives us a way for understanding nature, which is to know that nature, everything in it, including eternal facts, are rationally explicable, right? You can identify the reason for why it is the way that it is. And this is an extraordinary scientific mindset, right? The idea that you could explain anything, right? Okay, similarly, the principle of identity of indiscernibles, right? What this says is that for two things to be distinct from one another, they have to have one or more properties or predicates that distinguish them. So, like, in the case of these two markers, we can know that they're not the same thing because I can identify this one is purple, this one is blue, right? We're going to talk in the next video about important implications about space and time, but that will have to wait because I want to try to wrap things up here. PMR is the principle of mereological relations, so you can know from the previous principles that the part of something is less than the whole of it. Why? Because the definition of a part and the definition of a whole and the principle of non-contradiction. And then relatedly, we also get a principle again that we will discuss more in the next video, the principle or law, I wrote principle/law of continuity, which is that nature makes no leaps. There's no case where light like teleports, say, from like right after emitting from the sun to where Pluto is, right? No, light has to cover the entire trajectory or continuum in order to travel to Pluto. And that nature in general works this way. Why? Because of the principle of sufficient reason. If, things could just operate in nature not through continuity, then there'd be no reason for why it stops the place that it does and why it pops up the place that it does, right? Why does the light get teleported from right out of the sun to Pluto? That would be something that would be inexplicable, right? It would violate the principle of sufficient reason. And so I want to end the video here, but hopefully you understand the basic thrust of this, the moves that Leibniz is making here. Leibniz thinks you can discover fundamental truths about the universe through a kind of algebraic mathematical model, and he thinks that you can sort of build out principles from this model, beginning with the most abstract, though with the widest generality, to increasingly concrete principles that apply to everything that is. There are no exceptions for any of these principles, and we do not discover them through experimentation. Instead, as we shall see in the next video, experimentation presupposes these facts. And so this is Leibniz's way of sort of reformulating the idea of innate ideas. Whereas Descartes sort of described it as, we're like wax and God like stamps rationality into us or something like that. By contrast, for Leibniz, we share in the order that is created by God. Our capacity to understand that order is actually, whenever we can reduce things to mathematical functions, as in this case, is actually equal and indistinguishable from God's knowledge of it. And that's why it constitutes perfect metaphysical knowledge. I hope this video was helpful to you, and I hope that you have a great week. Please email me if you have any issues with the midterm. Okay, bye.